In scholarly estimation, the earliest Christians, or Christ followers, are Jews. Yet this group that starts to creep into the narrative of the book of Acts, what we call Gentiles, is called God-fearers. And there are proselytes. What are these categories, and when did this stuff start happening? Do we have any archaeological evidence that can help us guide us on understanding what a God-fearer is?
Paula, Dr. Fredriksen, and I always spell that last name. It's either, I always mess and put an O in, and I don't mean to.
It's Norwegian, not Swedish. Very important distinction.
You must get offended and I don't mean to. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. My fourth question is, what evidence do we have of Second Temple Jews actively accepting non-Israelite God-fearers into Jewish fold, or making full-blown Jewish converts out of non-Israelite proselytes?
Okay, I'm not sure why you're referring to them as non-Israelite. They're non-Jews. We should define what a God-fearer is. A God-fearer is somebody who is an active pagan who is also involved somehow with the synagogue community. And we have tons of inscriptions of people like this, sometimes identified as theos-based God-fearer in the text. And we know from other inscriptions that their husband had a day job as the priest of Zeus, or my favorite is Julia Severa, who's a contemporary of Paul, who builds an oikos, a synagogue building in Akmonia, and her day job is she's a priestess in the imperial cult, we know from other inscriptions. So she's a blue-blooded Roman who's also a sponsor of the synagogue community. And how do we know this? Because these people, when they give benefactions to the synagogue, they get a donor plaque, which was inscribed in stone, thank God, so that people like me can find them and know that this was going on. Wow. You have God-fearers referred to in literary texts, and that doesn't mean that they were making. It's not like they were taking a conversion class and stopped dead in the middle. They're just as pagans. It's a both and Mediterranean model of just as you will have Jewish inscriptions that call on Zeus, Gaia, and Helios, because that's a formula when you manumit a slave. And those are erected. They do this in the prosuche, in the prayer house, which is a synagogue inscription, releasing my slave, in the name of God, the Almighty, the Blessed, the Jewish benediction, manumitting the slave, calling as witnesses sky, earth, and sun, Zeus, Gaia, and Helios. And those are pagan gods dropping into the Jewish synagogues. So there's a lot of Mediterranean mixing. And in the vernacular, you have words like Hellenizing, Judaizing, Persianizing, to Medize, which means that even though you have this idea of distinct groups, you also have an idea of people adopting some of the customs of another group. And so God-fearers are these mixing pagans who are obviously welcomed into the synagogue, or they wouldn't be getting donor plaques put on the walls of the buildings. And I assume that group would have been the group that Paul pulled his ex-pagans out of, because they would have been already have some kind of biblical literacy. Here's Paul talking about people like Abraham and David and Messiah, talking about a really Jewish idea like the resurrection of the dead. This would have been a pagan group that would already be prepared to know something about that, because Moses is heard every week in the synagogue. So they're hearing these stories in Greek, Bible stories, and then apostles of Christ come into town. They're able to work all these charismatic acts, and they form, I think, within the penumbra of the synagogue, a group of ex-pagan pagans, which is not what a God-fearer is. A God-fearer is a Judaizing pagan. Luke is very delicate about this. He doesn't mention that all the God-fearers he talks about in his synagogues are still pagan, but they are. That's what a God-fearer is. Now, a proselyte is somebody who's crossing over all the way. I think one of the best evidence we have of this is, first of all, Philo, who talks about the necessity of welcoming the proselyte, and he uses the word incomer for proselyte. And he likens Abraham as the first model for that, because Abraham leaves the gods of his father and goes with the God of Israel. Somehow it's not explained in Genesis 12, but there are all sorts of stories about how this happens that fill in the blanks later on. And we also have irritated pagans observing that if a pagan God-fearer is the father who takes a nap one day out of every 7 and starts avoiding pork, the next thing is his sons are going to go all the way and be circumcised and give their allegiance from Roman law to Jewish law. So pagans also say that there's a full crossing over with what we term conversion, and there's this both and model of God-fearing. But that's our evidence for the fact that proselytes were part of the mix. They're Jews of a special sort, but they're Jews. It's clearer for gentlemen than it is for ladies.
Right. And the process is obviously different with the snipping.
Yes.
As far as Luke goes, a couple questions. I've heard Dom recently. He wants me to call him Dom. He says, stop calling me John Dominic Cross and Dr. John. Call me Dom. He says he thinks Luke was written either to a group of or to an individual who was this God-fearer, God-lover. And that
Theophilus, right.
Theophilus. And it's like would identify with the crowd you're talking about, this in-between somebody who was probably full-fledged into the God of Israel through Christ in some way. In Acts, which I think the same author probably wrote Luke and Acts, Acts chapter 10, Peter, it's kind of a funny story to me.
Oh, Cornelius?
Yeah, I'm kind of like, it makes me go, why did
the angel saying, come on, Peter, and I don't know.
It sounds more like a fiction to me of like writing, like Peter would have been like this, because I don't know. I mean,
well, generations of New Testament scholars and half of my undergraduates think that Jews never ate with Gentiles, which we also know is completely false, because they were members of professional guilds. And one of the things professional guilds do, these associations, is you eat together once a month. And we know that we have Jews who are members of the Purple Dyers Guild and something like that. So Jews and pagans eat together. And yet Luke, who's shaping a good story, is making Peter at this dramatic crux be the first apostle to the Gentiles. And so it's drama, but the high priest entertained the Roman legate during the high holidays when the Roman legate was in town in Jerusalem. They ate together.
I just find that story with Peter quite funny because they have him be the guy, right? Because Paul in his letter says, I'm the one to the Gentiles. But then they have Peter go. And then when Peter does, he's like, oh, what the heck? No. And then, of course, there's the
how do I do this? Right.
Right. And then, they are allowed in, and they are welcome. I think there's a real reason he has Peter do it. But, anyway, I don't want to read too much into that. But as far as Cornelius goes, I think this person fits the categories that you're describing here. Because
perfectly.
The term God-fearer, right? Which is, if we're going to want to know what the New Testament means when it uses this term, as an academic, let's pretend I came to the New Testament. All I've ever read, asking you as an academic, I'm a layperson. Okay. I read the New Testament, I hear this guy named Cornelius, he becomes saved, he follows this Jesus movement, and even the guys are like, what? Hold on, he's not supposed to, how come but God changes something? What is that? I don't understand. But the term God-fear is used. And you being an academic who's read vast amounts of other extra.
It's what I do for a living, right?
Right. How would you convey to me to convince me what a God-fearer actually is? And if I asked you the question as a layperson who's not an expert, doesn't know the languages, never read anything other than the New Testament, and I said, well, couldn't Cornelius have been a Jew who apostatized at one point and then came back? Or, I know this sounds strange, or an Israelite from the northern kingdom that might have become a Gentile over time? Or
he's depicted as a Roman soldier in the text. Right. I mean, you can say, well, Luke didn't really mean to make him a Roman soldier. He's actually somebody who's on vacation from the Galil or something. But he's a Roman soldier, which means he's involved as an officer it's Roman military units are religious units. The standards are like mobile altars for sacrifices. It's not being in the military for a Roman means that you have certain obligations to the gods of Rome, and but he also builds a synagogue and is a God-fearer, which is again this mix of you can be a pagan and you can also be part of a synagogue community, and which just makes good sense. Think of it, you're a minority ethnic community within a larger pagan religious institution, which is the ancient city. What better way to have good relations with your neighbors than to have no fences?
Thank you.
Thank you to those who contributed in the GoFundMe on making this trip possible for these 12 recordings with Paula Fredriksen. I want to give a special shout out to you. Your names are chiseled in history. I also want to thank everybody who has become a patron of MythVision, making stuff like this possible, taking academic work that is hiding behind all of these scholarship, all of these colleges, and making it public knowledge for everybody to learn.